Traveling this stretch of U.S. Highway 80 from Selma to Montgomery, the same path the marchers marched, you can almost still hear their voices on the wind.
We're gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
We wanted to shed the light of day on what was happening when it was dark, and that's what that movement brought out.
On March 21st, 1965, 3,200 demonstrators left Selma, crossing the Alabama River, headed for the state capital of Montgomery, 54 miles away.
It is a Sunday to be remembered.
Their cause was simple: bring an end to the roadblocks that made voter registration almost impossible for African Americans living in the Deep South.
I'm so glad I'm fighting for my rights.
The march was inspired by the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, a voting rights protester killed a few weeks earlier by an Alabama state trooper. The marchers' first attempt ended in disaster. For the people of Selma, the Edmund Pettus Bridge was their West Florissant Avenue, and what happened to them here on what became known as Bloody Sunday stirred the nation. On that day, March 7th, 600 protesters left from Brown Chapel and crossed the bridge. But as soon as they reached the other side, they were stopped by state troopers who ordered them to turn around.
You are ordered to disperse.
The marchers refused. Then the angry troopers plunged into the crowd, attacking the marchers with billy clubs and cattle prods.
Tear gas had begun to burst in the air, and people had begun to be beaten down to the ground. Dogs and horses had begun to push their way into the crowd, just trampling over people as if they weren't human beings.
Cheyenne Webb Kreisberg was the youngest protester caught in the chaos of Bloody Sunday. She was only 8 years old. That's her sitting in the lap of Dr. Martin Luther King, who would eventually lead the successful march from Selma to Montgomery 2 weeks later. But on Bloody Sunday, it was another pastor, Reverend Hosea Williams, who came to Cheyenne's rescue.
As he picked me up, my little legs were still galloping in his arms, and I turned to him and said in my own childish voice, "Put me down because you are not running fast enough."
When pictures of the Bloody Sunday attack were broadcast that night on network television, it caused a national sensation, just as the images from Ferguson would do 50 years later. And while the intensity of the police response in Ferguson was different from Selma, they shared some of the same terrible optics.
We are here from St. Louis to demonstrate, to witness our love for our fellow citizens in Selma.
Just as protesters from other cities flocked to Ferguson after the Michael Brown shooting, many were drawn to Selma after Bloody Sunday.
I didn't want to go to Selma.
Sister Mary Antona Ebo was one of 6 Catholic nuns from St. Louis who flew to Selma 2 days after Bloody Sunday to offer the marchers moral support. Sister Ebo still lives in St. Louis, and even though she is about to turn 91, she made sure to arrange a ride to Ferguson to lend her support.
I'm not too sure that the governor's group is going to be the answer. I'm not too sure that the people on the streets of Ferguson will be the answer. But somewhere, somehow, some time has to be taken to listen to one another. We're not listening to each other.
There's been a split between the younger generation and the older generation.
Malik Shakur is 19. He lives in North St. Louis and spent a lot of time on the front lines in Ferguson.
We, as a younger generation, see that, we want things to change now. We've seen very, very subtle progress, but it's not the progress that we want. We still know that there's a disparity amongst black and white, and we're just sick and fed up with it.
If there is a generational split in the post-Ferguson movement, and sometimes it certainly seems there is, it comes as no surprise to those who were part of the march in Selma. This is the house where Dr. Martin Luther King stayed when he organized the march from Selma to Montgomery. But the push for voting rights had begun 2 years earlier, led by a group of students, and some of them were not very happy with Dr. King's approach.
One of the slogans was, "Hands that pick cotton can now pick our public officials."
In 1965, Charles Malden was the head of the local student union, one of the groups pushing for voting rights long before Dr. King led the march from Selma to Montgomery.
That's always been a generational rift between the young and the older. The young folks are less patient. The old folks have a little bit more wisdom. And that conflict, that tension is what works it out in almost every social movement.
It was, so beautiful to be reconnected with my past.
Malik Shakur knows a lot about what happened in Selma. Thanks to a St. Louis program called Cultural Leadership, he and hundreds of other local teenagers have traveled to Selma for a chance to study civil rights history and to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Selma, there was physical barriers set in the law that we wanted to fight. And now it's more of moral barriers that we want to fight. We want to change the way black people are viewed and perceived in society, which is definitely a harder, more philosophical battle to do.
The activists in Selma had been organizing voting rights protests even before Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed. The first demonstrations in Ferguson were spontaneous and relied on the galvanizing power of social media instead of a high-profile leader.
We all realized that the movement was bigger than any of us individually, and that is a lesson for Ferguson, is that it has the opportunity to be the next Selma, for the modern times, if it handles its politics well. And that means a lot of patience and even sometimes suffering. And I know that's not an easy thing to tell people to do, but we did it and we won.
The bridge where before the marchers had been turned back is crossed without incident.
50 years after Bloody Sunday, some might think Selma would try to run from its troubled history. But today the town sells and celebrates the tumultuous events that made Selma a turning point in the civil rights movement. The marchers in Selma accomplished their immediate goal. 5 months later, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. But 50 years later, in places like Selma and Ferguson, many of the underlying issues have changed very little. 5 decades later, life in Selma is for many residents still a grinding struggle. Since 1965, the city's population has dropped by a third. Many businesses have long been out of business. As in most small southern towns, there are pockets of old world gentility, but more than 40% of the people who live in Selma do so in poverty. And lurking below all that Spanish moss in the city's oldest cemetery, there are ever-present reminders of a past not old enough to be considered ancient history. Even the bridge remains named for the Confederate general who was also the head of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan.
The social reckoning is not like it should be.
Al Ben has been reporting about life in Alabama since 1964.
Well, much of it, like most in the Deep South, segregation still rules.
Selma is trying to burnish its image, especially with the world watching again next month as the city marks the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery March. And then, of course, there's the movie sharing Selma's history with a new generation. But what is the takeaway for places like Ferguson from a place like Selma?
Selma has done more for the world than it has done for itself.
Former Mayor James Perkins Jr. believes one answer is the power of the vote, and he should know. He was Selma's first black mayor. But in the town where the battle for voting rights was waged and won in 1965, electing an African-American mayor would still take another 35 years.
If you don't vote, you typically don't count in government. And as a consequence, I think if Ferguson really wants to change its paradigm, its dynamic, the people are going to have to equate what happens to them on the street to what happens when they don't go to the polls and vote.
It takes tilling the soil to get a good crop.
Charles Malden knows to those fighting for social change it can be hard waiting for the harvest. But he also knows what it's like when the harvest comes in. His mother, Artie's Wellington Malden, was the first person to register on the first day the new federal voting rights law went into effect. A copy of her registration form was cast in silver and attached to the penholder on Lyndon Johnson's desk in the White House. But Charles Malden says what happened in Selma was about more than voting rights. It was about empowerment.
It unleashed us to have more skills and more determination to fight, because nothing ever remains permanent. You have to struggle for it all the time.
What happened in Selma and what happened in Ferguson are largely viewed as an issue of white versus black. But it's also about daylight versus the darkness. The concerns raised by Ferguson and the lessons taught by Selma, though different in many of the details, are bringing the issues that have long lingered in the shadows back into the sunshine. Whether we discuss them or dismiss them, many hard truths remain. And until they're resolved, can we say that old bridge in Selma has really been crossed?
You know, when you're 90, you keep wondering what's going to happen around the next corner. And that's what I keep thinking. I can't come home now, God, because I got to see what's going to happen around this next corner.